They say every restaurant has a table where history sits down uninvited, where words are sharper than knives, and one wrong reply can cut deeper than steel. The Gray Oak was the kind of place Charleston whispered about when it wanted to impress. Tucked into the brick-lined stretch of the historic district, it looked like a piece of another century. Arched windows, wrought iron balconies, and a carved oak door that had welcomed governors, authors, and the occasional celebrity passing through South Carolina's low country. Inside, candlelight glowed in glass hurricanes, silverware shone like it had been polished by angels, and the air smelled faintly of seared scallops and rosemary. Naomi Carter moved through it like she belonged there, though she knew she was still the newest hire on the floor. Her crisp white shirt was tucked perfectly into her black skirt, her hair tied back in a low knot, and her steps were quiet but purposeful. She had been in the Gray Oak for just over 2 weeks, long enough to learn the rhythm of the place. The low hum of conversation, the clink of wine glasses, the soft music from the pianist in the corner. But tonight was different. Table 7 sat in the center of the main dining room, a round mahogany island in a sea of linen and crystal. It was reserved for the powerful, the people whose last names could get you a job interview or a door slammed in your face. Tonight, that table belonged to Grant Whitmore. She had heard the name before she'd even arrived in Charleston. Whitmore Investments was one of the biggest players in New York real estate. The man himself was notorious for buying struggling historic properties in the South, gutting them, and selling them as luxury condos. Handsome in a sharp, angular way, with silver at his temples and a wardrobe of tailored suits, he was a Southern gentleman's charm crossed with a Wall Street predator's bite. Naomi approached with the wine list, the weight of it like a ledger in her hands. "Good evening, sir," she said, her voice even. "Would you like to see our reserve selection?" Grant looked up, and the pause was deliberate. His eyes moved over her in the way some wealthy men look at staff, not as people, but as variables in a service equation. "Tell me, miss." He tilted his head, waiting. "Carter," she replied. "Miss Carter," he said slowly. "Do you know the difference between a sommelier and a waitress with a wine menu?" The nearby tables quieted. The pianist's hands faltered, leaving a note suspended awkwardly in the air. Naomi could feel heat rising in the room, not from the candles, but from the attention now focused entirely on her. "Yes, Mr. Whitmore," she said. "A sommelier understands that wine isn't chosen, it's matched, like a dance partner. The wrong one will step on your toes, but the right one will make you forget there's anyone else in the room." It was not the answer he expected. His mouth quirked slightly, almost a smirk. "And which would you match with a Wagyu ribeye, charred medium rare with a hint of smoked sea salt?" Naomi didn't blink. 2015 Chateau Montrose, Saint Estèphe. Structured tannins, enough dark fruit to meet the beef, and a minerality that will keep the smoke from drowning. The silence that followed was thick, but it was not the same silence as before. It was the sound of people reconsidering what they thought they knew about the girl with the wine menu. Grant leaned back, studying her as if she had just placed an unfamiliar chess piece on the board. "Bring it," he said finally. She moved to the cellar, her heart steady. She hadn't been bluffing. Wine knowledge was one of the few luxuries she'd allowed herself in her old life, long before Charleston, before the Gray Oak. She remembered weekends in her tiny apartment in Savannah, borrowing books on viticulture from the library, scribbling notes in the margins until her fingers cramped. When she returned with the bottle, she noticed Edward Langford, the owner of the Gray Oak, standing near the far wall. His salt and pepper hair and linen blazer gave him the air of a man who had seen 1,000 confrontations in his dining room, but his eyes were fixed on her. As Naomi poured the wine, she could feel Grant watching her every move, the angle of the bottle, the twist of her wrist, the clean presentation of the label. These were small performances, but they mattered here. He took a sip, held it, swallowed. "Not bad," he said finally, the corners of his mouth softening. But there was no mistaking it. She had won the first round. When she stepped away from the table, Edward intercepted her. "Well done," he murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "You handled him better than most." Naomi offered a polite smile. "I wasn't handling him. I was serving the wine." Edward's eyes narrowed, but not in disapproval. "Be careful with Grant Whitmore. Men like him don't enjoy being proven wrong in public." The rest of the night passed in a blur of orders and quiet glances toward Table 7. Naomi noticed the way Grant's tone shifted with his companions, the way he leaned in when he spoke about Charleston's waterfront. There was a hunger in his voice that had nothing to do with food. When the last plates were cleared and the dining room emptied, Naomi found herself lingering by the windows, looking out onto the cobblestone street. She had faced worse men than Grant Whitmore, but there was something about him, something that told her this would not be the last time they stood on opposite sides of a table. From across the room, Edward was still watching, and in that moment, Naomi realized something unsettling. She was no longer just serving tables at the Gray Oak. She had stepped into a game she didn't yet understand, a game where the stakes might be much higher than tips and wine lists. The Gray Oak closed the way Charleston's tide retreated, quietly, without fuss, leaving the room still smelling faintly of salt and something warm. Naomi was stacking wine glasses at the service station when she noticed him again. Edward Langford was not a man who blended into a crowd, even in his own restaurant. He had the kind of posture that suggested both a good tailor and a lifetime of knowing exactly who he was. Tonight, though, he was not at his usual vantage point by the front desk, or gliding between tables, charming regulars with a word here, a hand on the shoulder there. He was in the farthest corner booth, the one tucked under a vintage low-country painting and partly hidden by a column. She thought he had left hours ago, but now he was there, still in his pale linen blazer, the top button of his shirt undone, an espresso cup in front of him. He wasn't drinking it. Instead, he was adjusting something in his lap, and Naomi's instincts, those sharp little needles that had served her in other jobs, other cities, told her it was a camera. Their eyes met briefly when she carried a stack of menus past his table. Edward's expression didn't change, but there was an almost imperceptible flicker, like someone who'd been caught at something he didn't want explained. "You're still here," she said when she passed him again, keeping her voice casual. "Owner's privilege," he replied, his baritone warm but careful. "Besides, sometimes the most interesting things happen after the last check is signed." She tilted her head toward the lens protruding just slightly from his lap. "Interesting enough to record?" If her question startled him, he didn't show it. "Documentation," he said evenly, "is a very polite form of self-defense." Naomi leaned against the booth's edge, lowering her voice. "Against who? Or should I say, against what?" Edward set the camera down on the table between them. It was a discreet, high-end model, the sort photographers used when they needed perfect clarity without the intrusion of flash. "Grant Whitmore," he said plainly. "He's been circling this place for over a year. First with offers, then with threats. I don't intend to sell, but men like him don't take no for an answer." Naomi thought about the way Grant had scanned the dining room earlier, as though taking inventory of not just the decor, but the very air itself. "So you think he's planning something tonight?" Edward's lips curved, but it was not a smile. "I don't think. I know. You saw the man at his table, the one with the checked blazer?" Naomi nodded. She had served him a glass of Sancerre. "His name's Howard Pierce. Real estate law. He doesn't leave Manhattan for anything less than a multi-million-dollar deal. I'd bet my wine cellar they're negotiating something tied to the waterfront properties." Naomi remembered overhearing snatches of conversation. Zoning exceptions, heritage site exemptions, condo ready within 18 months. She hadn't pieced them together at the time, but now the puzzle began to take shape. "And the recording?" she asked. Edward tapped the camera. "Insurance?" "If he's using intimidation, or worse, to force sales, I want it on record. He's clever about his business deals, but clever men still slip when they think they're untouchable." She looked toward table 7. The chairs were empty now, but the ghost of the evening's tension still seemed to linger there, like perfume on a silk scarf. "So why tell me?" "Because," Edward said, folding his hands, "you handled him better than most tonight, and you didn't flinch." "That tells me you're not just here for tips." Naomi considered her answer carefully. "I'm here to work," she said, "but I also don't like watching people get steamrolled." Edward's eyes softened. "Then we might understand each other." He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and slid something across the table. A plain white envelope. "If you see or hear anything in the dining room, jot it down. Details matter. Names, times, exact words if you can, and keep it to yourself. The fewer people who know, the better." Naomi hesitated only a second before tucking the envelope into her order pad. She didn't need to open it to know there would be cash inside, a retainer as much for her discretion as for her cooperation. When she left the booth, the restaurant felt different. The air seemed heavier, the shadows sharper. She busied herself with clearing cutlery, but she was aware of every sound now, the creak of the front door hinges, the low murmur from the kitchen, the faint hum of the cooler in the bar. Out of habit, she glanced toward the wide mirror behind the bar. From that angle, she could see Edward still in the booth, his head slightly bowed over the camera, reviewing footage. The reflection also revealed something else. A slim man in a dark overcoat lingering just outside on the sidewalk, his face partly obscured by the glare of the street lamp. She froze for half a second, then moved toward the door as if to check the exterior tables. When she stepped outside, the man turned away quickly, disappearing into the curve of the street. "Everything all right?" called Jack from the kitchen pass-through. "Just checking the weather," Naomi lied, glancing up at the clear, star-pricked sky. By the time she came back inside, Edward had packed the camera away and was sliding out of the booth. "See you tomorrow, Miss Carter," he said. His tone was as polite as if they'd just exchanged pleasantries over a menu, but the weight behind it was unmistakable. That night, Naomi walked home through the narrow streets of the historic district, the scent of night-blooming jasmine following her. Charleston was beautiful at night. Balconies draped with ironwork, shutters painted in muted coastal colors, the distant sound of waves against the battery. But beauty, she had learned long ago, was often the perfect cover for trouble. Her apartment was small, on the second floor of a weathered house that leaned slightly toward the street. She locked the door behind her, kicked off her shoes, and pulled the envelope from her bag. Inside was exactly what she expected: a folded sheet of paper and 5 crisp $100 bills. The note read, "Everything leaves a trace, even men like him." She set the money aside, but she kept the note in her hand. There was a truth to it she couldn't shake, and she suspected she would need to remember it sooner rather than later. The following evening, the Gray Oak was busier than usual. Edward was in his customary position by the host stand, but Naomi noticed he kept glancing toward the corner booth. She also noticed that the man in the dark overcoat was back, this time seated at the bar, nursing a whiskey he barely touched. When Grant Whitmore arrived, 10 minutes late, of course, Edward's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Naomi could feel the tension ripple through the staff, a subtle but unmistakable shift in the room's temperature. Grant greeted Edward with the kind of smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Langford," he said smoothly, "you've still got the best corner in Charleston. Shame if someone else got their hands on it." Naomi, carrying a tray of oysters to another table, caught the words and filed them away. She didn't look at him directly, but she could feel his awareness of her, like a draft across the back of her neck. Edward simply replied, "I've been keeping it safe a long time, Whitmore. I intend to keep doing so." From the bar, the man in the overcoat shifted slightly, as though leaning in to catch every word. Naomi realized then that whatever game she had stepped into, it was already in motion, and the pieces were moving fast. The next Thursday evening rolled in with a drizzle that slicked Charleston's cobblestones and turned the gaslight reflections into wavering halos. Naomi Carter arrived at the Gray Oak just before the first reservation, her hair pulled into a precise knot, her mind sharpened like the edge of a chef's knife. The memory of Edward Langford's warning and the envelope still sat in the back of her mind. When she stepped into the dining room, she immediately sensed it. The air was too still for this early hour, the staff too careful in their movements. Edward stood at the host stand, scanning the entrance like a sentry awaiting a siege. "Full house?" Naomi asked, sliding her apron strings into a knot. Edward didn't look at her. "Full enough. But it's not the number of people that changes the room. It's the ones who matter." She didn't have to ask who he meant. 10 minutes later, the door swung open, and in walked Grant Whitmore. Grant had the kind of presence that rearranged a space the moment he entered it. Tonight he wore a charcoal suit cut sharp enough to slice air, a pale blue shirt open at the throat, and a faint smile that might have been mistaken for warmth if you didn't know better. Behind him came 3 men and 1 woman, their voices low but purposeful. Naomi recognized the woman from glossy magazine pages, Caroline Wexler, a luxury developer with projects up and down the East Coast. The men, though unfamiliar, radiated the same kind of moneyed aggression. Their shoes alone could pay Naomi's rent for months. Edward's greeting was civil but cool. "Mr. Whitmore, Ms. Wexler, welcome back." "Always a pleasure," Grant said smoothly, though his eyes flickered past Edward and landed on Naomi. She felt it, a subtle tightening in her chest. Not fear exactly, but the acute awareness of being studied. He didn't look away, even as Edward led them toward table 7, already set with the Gray Oak's finest crystal. Naomi approached with the wine list, her tone even. "May I start you with something from our reserve cellar?" Grant leaned back in his chair, one arm draped lazily over the backrest. "Surprise me, Miss Carter. You did last time." She met his gaze without flinching. "Then you'll have to trust my judgment again." "Dangerous proposition," he murmured, but his eyes gleamed. She left them to their menus and slipped into the cellar, noting as she passed that Edward was stationed in the corner booth once more. This time, though, the camera was more discreet, angled just so, its lens catching both the shimmer of candlelight and the subtle tilt of Grant's head toward his companions. Naomi returned with a 2012 Brunello di Montalcino Riserva. As she poured, conversation at the table hushed. Grant glanced at her, then turned to the others. "You've all seen the projections," he said. "Charleston's waterfront is underdeveloped. The historic district has untapped potential. Boutique condos, luxury retail. The city council is persuadable." Caroline Wexler's lacquered nails tapped against her glass. "Persuadable isn't the same as legal." Grant smiled faintly. "Laws bend for the right incentives, and if they don't bend, they can be rewritten." Naomi's hand stilled for half a second before she steadied the bottle and finished the pour. She committed the words to memory. The rest of the meal unfolded like a silent chess match. Naomi moved between tables, but her ears stayed tuned to the rhythm of Table 7's voices. There were mentions of air rights, easement swaps, and fast-tracking permits. More than once, she caught Edward watching her as if confirming she was listening. When dessert menus arrived, Grant waved them away. "We'll take espresso, 4. And Miss Carter, join us for a moment." It wasn't a request. Naomi kept her expression neutral as she set a demi-tasse in front of each guest, then stood at the edge of the table. "Tell me," Grant said, "what's your opinion on the city's waterfront? You've been here long enough to have an impression." She glanced briefly at Edward's booth before answering. "I think history is a rare ingredient. Once you take it out of a place, you can't put it back. The flavor's gone." Caroline Wexler chuckled softly, but Grant didn't. He studied her like she'd just revealed a card he hadn't expected her to hold. "Interesting," he said finally. "You sound like someone with a stake in the game." "Only in keeping the menu balanced," Naomi replied. When they left, the air in the dining room seemed to exhale. Edward rose from the corner booth and met her near the bar. "What did you hear?" "Enough to know they're not talking about preservation," she said. Edward nodded slowly. "Keep listening. They're building something bigger than condos, and if they succeed, this part of Charleston will never be the same." Naomi untied her apron, her fingers slower than usual. She had stepped deeper into the game without quite realizing it, and now there was no safe way to step back. Later that night, walking home under the damp glow of street lamps, Naomi thought about Grant's eyes when she'd spoken of history as an ingredient. There had been no anger, no mockery, only curiosity. And that, she decided, was the most dangerous reaction of all. By Monday morning, the air in Charleston had shifted. The rain had washed the city streets clean, and the salt-heavy breeze coming in from the harbor felt sharper, cooler. But inside the gray oak, there was a different kind of change. One Naomi Carter could feel in the way Edward Langford was watching her. She'd arrived early, hoping for a quiet prep shift before the lunch rush. Instead, she found Edward already at the host stand, jacket off, sleeves rolled neatly to the elbow. He had a manila folder in one hand and the look of someone who'd been turning over a decision all weekend. "Miss Carter," he said, motioning her into the corner booth, the same one where he'd set his camera before. She slid into the seat, the polished wood cool against her palms. "Something wrong?" "That depends," Edward replied, placing the folder between them. "On whether you think opportunity is a blessing or a test." She raised an eyebrow. "What kind of opportunity?" Edward flipped the folder open. Inside was a neatly typed offer letter on the gray oak's letterhead. Position: floor manager, private dining and reserve room. Effective: immediately. Naomi stared at it. "You're promoting me?" "Yes," he said. "You've handled difficult guests better than most. You understand the nuances of service and—" He paused. "You have a talent for listening." Her pulse quickened. She knew what he meant by that last part. "The reserve room handles our most exclusive guests," Edward went on. "Politicians, bankers, investors. It's delicate work. You'll have control over seating charts, wine pairing lists, and you'll be present for conversations others can't afford to overhear." Naomi kept her expression neutral. "And I'm guessing you'd like me to keep my ears open for one guest in particular." "Grant Whitmore will be back," Edward said flatly. "When he is, I want every detail of his plans, who he meets, what they discuss, what's on the table, figuratively and literally." She sat back, weighing it. A promotion meant more pay, more influence, but also more exposure. Grant wasn't stupid. He'd notice if she was suddenly everywhere he went. And there was another problem. She didn't fully know what Edward planned to do with the information she gathered. "What's in it for me?" she asked finally. "A salary increase, your own staff team, and the authority to run the reserve room as you see fit," Edward replied. "And if we keep Whitmore from gutting the waterfront, you'll have had a hand in saving a piece of Charleston's soul." Naomi looked at the offer letter again. She thought of the narrow cobblestone streets, the centuries-old buildings, the harbor at sunrise. She also thought of Grant's words about rewriting laws. "Fine," she said at last, sliding the letter back toward him. "But if I do this, I do it my way. No tricks that put the staff at risk. No illegal surveillance." Edward's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but close. Agreed. By Friday evening, the promotion was official. Naomi now had a set of keys that unlocked the wine cellar, the private dining wing, and a small office tucked behind the kitchen. She used the afternoon to rearrange the reserve room, subtle changes only, but enough to give her better sight lines to every table. That night, she got her first real test. The Whitmore party arrived just before 8, smaller this time. Only Grant and a single companion, a tall man in an impeccably cut navy suit. "This is Robert Alden," Grant said as Naomi greeted them. "Robert handles my legislative concerns." Legislative concerns. Naomi filed the phrase away as she led them to the best table in the reserve room, one with a clear view of the harbor through tall windows. Over oysters and champagne, the two men spoke in low tones. Naomi caught only fragments at first: rezoning proposals, council votes, heritage exemption clauses. But when she brought the second course, their conversation sharpened. "The holdout properties are the problem," Alden was saying. "Langford's got enough influence to sway the preservation board." "Then we make it worth his while to not sway them," Grant replied. "Everyone has a price." Naomi kept her hands steady as she placed their plates. Half an hour later, Grant requested a bottle of vintage Madeira, a rare one, kept in the cellar's locked reserve cabinet. Naomi went to retrieve it, but instead of heading straight back, she ducked into her office and jotted down every word she remembered. She slipped the note into the manila envelope Edward had given her. When she returned, Grant watched her pour with that same unreadable gaze. "You've been here, what, 3 weeks?" he asked casually. "4, she said. "You're wasted on just service. You ever think about bigger things?" Naomi smiled faintly. "I like where I am." Grant's eyes held hers for a beat longer than necessary before he took the glass. "We'll see about that." After they left, Edward appeared in the doorway of the reserve room. "Well?" "They're looking for a way around you," she said quietly. "And they think you can be bought." Edward's expression hardened. "Then they don't know me as well as they think." Naomi glanced toward the empty table where Grant had sat. "No," she said, "but they're going to try." That night, Naomi locked the reserve room herself. As she turned the key, she realized the promotion wasn't just a step up. It was a chess move. She had been placed directly in the line of attack. And now, she would have to play like she meant to win. The idea came to Naomi on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, when the light through the gray oak's tall windows was the color of warm honey and the dining room sat empty except for the hum of the ceiling fans. She was reviewing seating charts in the reserve room, thinking about sight lines, how to keep her guests feeling secluded while giving herself a clear vantage point. It was a delicate balance, too obvious, and someone like Grant Whitmore would sense her watching. Too hidden, and she'd miss the moments when people forgot they were being observed. That was when she remembered the corner table by the archway, in the main dining room just beyond the reserve room doors. Table 14. It was unremarkable at first glance. 2 chairs, a candle, a small arrangement of white lilies. But from that spot, she could see nearly every table in the reserve room through the open double doors. More importantly, diners seated inside rarely noticed anyone sitting out there. The problem was that table 14 wasn't prime real estate. On busy nights, it often sat empty until a walk-in took it, and on quiet nights, the staff skipped setting it all together. Naomi tapped her pen against the chart. What if she made it more than a table? What if it became something no one dared to occupy, but everyone noticed? 2 nights later, The opportunity presented itself. A man in his early 30s came in just before the dinner rush. His shirt was pressed but fraying at the cuffs, and he carried himself with the hesitance of someone stepping into a place that wasn't meant for him. Naomi met him at the door. "I'm looking for Edward Langford," he said. "He's not in yet," Naomi replied. "Can I help you?" The man's eyes softened. "Maybe. My name's Michael Jennings. My mother used to work here. Not here exactly, before it was the Gray Oak, back when it was the River Song Inn." Naomi knew the name. The building had been many things in its long life, but the River Song had been a working-class dining hall, famous for its crab stew and live bluegrass. "She passed last year," Michael continued, pulling a folded photograph from his pocket. It showed a young woman in a plain apron, her smile broad and unguarded. "This was her station, this exact table." He pointed toward table 14. Naomi felt something shift inside her. She always said, no matter how grand the place got, there should be a spot for the people who made it what it is. "I don't have much, but I'd like to pay to keep that table empty, just empty. For her. For all of them." When Edward arrived, Naomi brought him to meet Michael. Edward listened without interrupting, his gaze lingering on the photograph. Then he nodded once. "Done," he said simply. "The table stays empty." That night, Naomi set table 14 with a single white candle and a framed card, reserved in honor of every invisible hand that has served within these walls. It didn't take long for guests to notice. Some whispered about it, others asked to move when seated there. Most simply glanced at it as they passed, the flame a small but constant reminder that not every story in the room belonged to the ones signing the checks. For Naomi, the table was more than a memorial. From her new position as floor manager, she began using it as a quiet vantage point. On nights when Grant Whitmore or his associates dined in the reserve room, she would stand near the empty table under the pretense of checking wine stock or straightening the lilies. From there, she caught snippets of conversation, numbers murmured over glasses of Bordeaux, names spoken just low enough to be deniable. One evening, as she lingered by the table, Grant himself stepped out from the reserve room. "Strange choice," he said, gesturing toward the candle. "An empty table in a place where every seat should be earning its keep." Naomi met his gaze evenly. "Some things are worth more than their price." He studied her for a long moment, the corner of his mouth curling as if she'd passed another unspoken test. "You really do believe that, don't you?" "I do," she said simply. Grant's eyes flicked to the framed card, then back to her. "Interesting." Without another word, he turned and went back inside. Later, Edward approached her in the bar. "You realize," he said quietly, "that table's going to become a symbol. People will start asking questions. That can be good or dangerous." Naomi looked toward table 14, its candle burning steadily. "Symbols have power," she said. "Let's make sure this one works for us." Within 2 weeks, the table had taken on a life of its own. Locals began leaving small tokens, a folded napkin, a handwritten thank you, a sprig of rosemary. Tourists photographed it. Staff members paused there at the start of their shifts, almost like touching a lucky charm. And Naomi kept listening. The table, after all, was exactly what she'd intended it to be, a memorial for the unseen. And the perfect place to see everything. The candle at table 14 burned low, its wax pooling like molten ivory on the silver plate. Naomi stood nearby, polishing a row of wine glasses that were already spotless. She wasn't watching the glasses, she was watching the reserve room. Grant Whitmore was there again. This time with Robert Alden and 2 other men Naomi didn't recognize. One was wiry, with close-cropped hair, and the restless energy of someone used to closing deals over a handshake and a threat. The other carried himself with quiet authority, his tailored suit hiding the bulk of a man who had once been something other than an executive. Naomi had learned their type quickly: political fixers, legal architects, the kind of men who could make a zoning map look like a private invitation. She knew from the stiffness in Edward Langford's shoulders, he was stationed at the bar tonight, that this meeting was different, important, dangerous. Earlier that day, Edward had given her a thin folder. "This is a preservation clause," he said. "If Whitmore signs it, he binds himself to keeping the riverfront facades intact and a percentage of units allocated to local businesses. It's legally airtight, thanks to a friend of mine on the planning board, but it has to be in his handwriting on one of his documents. Otherwise, he'll just say it's not binding." Naomi flipped through the pages. "So you want me to, what? Slide this into his paperwork and hope he signs it?" "I want you to make him think he wants to sign it," Edward said. "That's your skill, Miss Carter. You make people forget they're being maneuvered." By the time the Whitmore party finished their entrees, Naomi had her opportunity. She approached with the dessert menus and a warm smile. "Gentlemen, before you decide on dessert, Mr. Whitmore, I believe you left some paperwork here last week," she said. She held out a sleek leather folder identical to the one Grant carried, except this one contained Edward's clause, printed on matching stationery, slid neatly among innocuous contracts. Grant arched an eyebrow. "Did I?" "Yes, sir," Naomi replied. "It was at table 14. I thought it best to keep it safe until you returned." She placed the folder on the table in front of him, then stepped back, letting the conversation resume around her. From her position by the sideboard, Naomi watched as Grant opened the folder. He leafed through casually at first, then more intently, clearly thinking the papers were his own. Robert Alden leaned over to point at a paragraph, and without hesitation, Grant pulled a pen from his inside pocket and signed at the bottom of the page. Naomi kept her face neutral, but inside her pulse thudded like the slow build of a drum roll. The rest of the meal passed without incident. When they left, Grant thanked her with that half-smile of his. "You take good care of my things, Miss Carter." "I try," she said, letting the words carry just enough weight to make him glance back at her before he walked out. In the empty reserve room, Edward picked up the folder where Grant had left it. He slid the signed page out and tucked it into his own jacket. "You've just changed the rules of the game," he said. Naomi crossed her arms. "Now what?" "Now," Edward said, "he can't bulldoze the facades or cut out the locals without breaking a contract that would hold up in any court in the state. He's boxed in, and he doesn't even know it yet." But Naomi wasn't as certain. She thought about the glint in Grant's eyes, the way he'd scanned her face before leaving. He was too careful a player to ignore a piece of paper he didn't remember drafting. And if he figured it out, she wouldn't just be the floor manager who served his wine. She'd be the one who played him at his own table. The next Friday night, Charleston's air was thick with summer heat, the kind that clung to the skin and made even the cobblestones seem to sweat. Inside the gray oak, however, the air was cool, controlled, until the moment Naomi Carter saw who walked in behind Grant Whitmore. It wasn't Robert Alden this time. The man was younger, dressed in a pale gray suit with the effortless precision of someone who could spend a fortune on tailoring and never have to think about it. His smile was broad, almost too friendly, and his handshake with Edward Langford lingered just long enough to suggest a shared history. "Naomi," Edward murmured as she passed him. "That's Travis Cole. Venture capitalist, Silicon Valley, and trouble." She'd heard of him. Articles about disruptive real estate technology. Whispers about companies swallowed whole. Lawsuits settled behind closed doors. If Grant was the strategist, Cole was the opportunist who set the traps. The Whitmore party didn't ask for the reserve room tonight. They demanded it. Within minutes, Naomi could sense something different in the way they occupied the space. They weren't just eating, they were staging. On her second pass through the room, she caught a fragment of conversation. "Health department's already been notified," Cole was saying. Grant's reply was lower, but she heard the words, violations, force closure, leverage, Langford. Her stomach tightened. This was no idle threat. They were preparing to use a fabricated food safety violation to shut the Gray Oak down. Naomi slipped into the kitchen under the pretense of checking an order. She found Marcus, the head chef, plating seared grouper. "Marcus," she said quietly, "I need you to check every station, every cooler, every prep surface, now. Gloves, temps, storage, document everything. Photos, timestamps. Don't ask why." Marcus didn't argue. He'd been in kitchens long enough to know when trouble was coming. Back in the reserve room, Cole was leaning back in his chair, tapping at his phone. "You'll have your inspector within 48 hours, he said. Naomi approached with a bottle of Sancerre, letting her presence interrupt. "Would you care for a top-up, Mr. Cole?" He glanced at her, amused. "Why not?" As she poured, she let her tone drop just enough to carry meaning. "You'll find the reserve room keeps its records as meticulously as its wine cellar." Grant's eyes flicked to hers, sharp. "Is that so?" "It is," she said, setting the bottle down with steady hands. "Every inspection, every temperature log, every supplier invoice, perfectly in order." Cole smirked, but Grant didn't. 2 days later, the inspector arrived. Naomi was ready. Marcus produced a folder with every document in chronological order, each signed and dated. Naomi led the inspector through the kitchen like a tour guide at a museum, pointing out spotless counters, sealed containers, and pristine storage. By the time they reached the dining room, the inspector's demeanor had shifted from suspicion to faint embarrassment. "You're well within code," he admitted. "Frankly, Bashu, this is one of the cleanest operations I've seen in months." Edward signed the report in front of him, making sure the manila copy was in full view. That evening, Grant returned alone. He sat at table 14, the candlelight making his features unreadable. Naomi approached, resisting the urge to glance toward Edward, who stood at the far end of the bar. "You handled that well," Grant said. "I handle my work," Naomi replied. He leaned forward slightly. "You think you've won something, Miss Carter? But the thing about winning," his smile was slow, deliberate, "is that it makes people notice you. And not everyone who notices you is on your side." Naomi didn't flinch. "I'm not here to win. I'm here to keep the menu balanced." Grant's eyes held hers for a long moment before he stood. "We'll see if you can keep your balance when the table shakes." When he left, Edward crossed the room. "He's not finished," Edward said. "I know," Naomi replied, glancing at the flickering candle on table 14. "That's why neither am I." The August heat lay heavy over Charleston, thick as molasses and slow to lift. Even the polished oak floors of the Gray Oak seemed to hold the day's warmth well into the evening. Naomi Carter had been floor manager for less than a month, but she had already grown accustomed to scanning the dining room like a general reviewing a battlefield, checking the positions, the players, the points of possible weakness. She wasn't expecting the man who walked in just before sunset. He looked familiar in a way she couldn't quite place. Tall, well-built but not imposing, with a calmness in his step that felt deliberate. His suit was perfectly cut but understated, the kind worn by people who could afford to impress without trying. When he reached the host stand, Edward Langford greeted him like an old friend. "Daniel Whitmore," Edward said warmly. "It's been too long." Naomi's eyes flicked up at the name. Whitmore. Daniel noticed her glance and smiled politely. "And you must be Naomi Carter. I've heard about you." Daniel Whitmore was nothing like his older brother. Where Grant entered a room like he owned it, Daniel moved as though the room had invited him. He had the same sharp Whitmore jawline, but his eyes, gray like a coastal morning, held no arrogance. "May I have a quiet table?" Daniel asked. "I'd like to speak with you both." Edward led him to a discreet corner booth, the same one where Naomi had been drawn into so many of his private conversations. When they were seated, Daniel set a leather folio on the table. "I'll get straight to it," he said, glancing between them. "You both know my brother's been trying to acquire this property. What you may not know is that our father's will gave me a deciding interest in the Whitmore family trust, including certain shares in Whitmore Investments." Naomi kept her face neutral, but her pulse quickened. "Shares that give you voting rights," Daniel said simply. "Enough to veto any major acquisition, if I choose to exercise them." Edward leaned back, folding his arms. "Why haven't you until now?" Daniel's expression shifted, a shadow crossing his features. "Because I wanted to believe Grant would make decisions that balanced profit with preservation. I was wrong. He's gone too far. Threats, manipulation, leveraging city officials. The waterfront project isn't just bad business. It's a betrayal of everything our family built." Naomi studied him carefully. "So you're here to stop him?" "Yes," Daniel said, "but I can't do it alone. My voting power is strong, but it's reactive. I can block a move, not initiate one. I need a formal partner within the community who can act in real time, on the ground." He looked directly at Naomi. "I want that partner to be you." The words hung in the air like the final bell of a service shift, shocking in their suddenness. Impossible to ignore. Naomi blinked. "Me? Why not Edward?" "Because Edward's position is obvious," Daniel replied. "Grant expects resistance from him. He doesn't expect it from you. You've already proven you can anticipate his moves without tipping your hand. And," Daniel's eyes softened just slightly, "you've built trust with the people he underestimates, staff, local vendors, even city council aides who dine here." Edward nodded slowly. "With your veto combined with her access, we could stall him indefinitely," Daniel finished. Naomi's mind raced. Partnering with Daniel meant stepping even deeper into the conflict. It meant Grant would have a personal reason to target her, not just a professional one. But it also meant real leverage, something beyond overheard conversations and symbolic gestures. "What would this partnership look like?" she asked. Daniel opened the folio, sliding a single document toward her. "A joint agreement between you and me, granting you proxy access to my Whitmore Trust vote for any decisions involving the Charleston waterfront. It's legal, binding, and," he tapped the page, "effective immediately upon signature." Naomi read the document twice. It was clean, ironclad, and it was exactly the kind of thing that would infuriate Grant beyond reason. "I'll sign," she said finally, "on one condition. This isn't just about stopping Grant. We use this leverage to protect local businesses, preserve the historic facades, and keep this community from becoming another playground for out-of-state investors." Daniel's smile was small, but genuine. "That's exactly why I came to you." She signed. The first test came sooner than expected. 3 nights later, Grant appeared at the Gray Oak with Caroline Wexler and Robert Alden. Over brandy in the reserve room, Naomi overheard him outlining the final steps for acquiring the last 2 holdout properties on the waterfront. "They'll fold by the next board meeting," Grant said confidently. "Once the vote passes, demolition begins within the quarter." Naomi excused herself, stepped into her office, and dialed Daniel's number. "They're pushing the vote at the next meeting," she said. "You'll need to be there." "I'll do more than be there," Daniel replied. "I'll kill it before it reaches the floor." 2 days later, the Whitmore Investments boardroom in New York was the site of a quiet but decisive battle. Grant presented his acquisition plan. Daniel exercised his veto. Legally, the matter was closed, but Grant didn't take it like a man defeated. That evening, he appeared at table 14. "You've made powerful friends," he said, his tone light, but his eyes like steel. "I make the friends I need," Naomi replied. Grant leaned closer. "Friends can become liabilities, especially when they stand in the way of something inevitable." Naomi met his gaze without blinking. "Then I guess we'll see how inevitable you really are." He straightened, smiling faintly. "You're playing a dangerous game, Miss Carter, but you're playing it well." When he left, Edward joined her at the table. "That was a public warning," he said. "And public warnings mean private plans are already in motion." Naomi looked at the candle burning steadily between them. "Then we'd better be ready before he makes his next move." Charleston's autumn came slowly, as if the city couldn't quite decide whether to trade its heavy summer air for the crispness of fall. In the mornings, a cool mist hung over the harbor, but by afternoon the humidity returned, wrapping the streets in a damp embrace. Naomi Carter had been living in a state of quiet readiness. Grant Whitmore's last warning at table 14 still echoed in her mind. She knew he wouldn't accept defeat, and waiting for his next strike felt like sitting across from a chess master who smiled every time he gave up a piece. She decided she wouldn't just wait. One evening, after the last guests had left, and the Gray Oak's lights had dimmed to their softest glow, Naomi called Edward Langford and Daniel Whitmore into the reserve room. She'd already laid out a stack of folders, each marked with a single word in black ink: community. "I've been thinking," she began, "about the candle at table 14. It started as a memorial, but it's become a symbol. People stop to take pictures. They talk about it. They ask questions. It's our way in." Edward leaned back, studying her. "Our way into what?" "To something bigger than just stopping Grant," Naomi said. "We can build something he can't fight without turning the entire city against him. A preservation fund. Not just for the waterfront, but for culinary apprenticeships, heritage building upkeep, and small business grants. We use the restaurant as the face of it." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "That's ambitious." "It's necessary," Naomi replied. "If we want to protect the city, we can't just say no to Grant. We have to say yes to something better." Edward exchanged a glance with Daniel EDE. "And how would we fund this?" Naomi slid a second folder toward them. Inside were lists of potential donors, local business owners, regional banks, even a handful of national culinary organizations she'd researched. "We start with people who have a stake in Charleston staying Charleston. Then we go public with a gala. Silent auction, tasting menu from top chefs, media coverage. The more visible we are, the harder it is for him to move without scrutiny." Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly, but not in doubt. "And what would we call this initiative?" Naomi hesitated for only a second. "The Carter Initiative. Not because I want my name on it, but because symbols need faces. And right now, I'm the one who can speak without being accused of political posturing." For the next month, Naomi worked as if she had two full-time jobs: floor manager by night, strategist by day. She met with vendors before service, sent emails to potential donors between wine pairings, and coordinated with local media contacts she'd quietly built relationships with over the years. The candle at table 14 became the unofficial logo, a simple white flame against a black background. Flyers began appearing in small shops and on notice boards around the historic district. The Carter Initiative, preserving our past, investing in our future. When the gala night came, the Gray Oak was transformed. The dining room shimmered under strings of Edison bulbs, and the scent of seared scallops mingled with roasted quail and buttered cornbread. Chefs from across the southeast filled the kitchen, their names printed on a long banner above the pass. Naomi moved through the room in a deep emerald dress, greeting guests, answering questions, and making sure every journalist got a clear view of the candle centerpiece at each table. Edward handled the silent auction, his easy charm coaxing bids higher, while Daniel worked the room like a seasoned diplomat. Halfway through the evening, Naomi stepped up to the small stage near the bar. "Charleston is more than buildings and business deals," she told the crowd. "It's hands that have poured coffee in the morning, folded napkins at night, and built a city worth preserving. The Carter Initiative is here to make sure those hands, and the history they hold, aren't swept aside for the sake of profit." The applause was immediate, warm, and loud enough that for a moment, Naomi allowed herself to believe they were untouchable. That illusion shattered when she saw him. Grant Whitmore, standing at the back of the room, glass of wine in hand, watching her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. He didn't approach. He didn't need to. The message was clear. "I see you. I see everything." After the event, Naomi counted the donations, enough to launch the initiative at scale. But Edward's expression was guarded. "You know he's going to come after this now," he said quietly. "I'm counting on it," Naomi replied. "The more he fights it, the more the city will see where he stands, and the more we can show them the difference between his vision and ours." Daniel placed a hand on the folder of pledged funds. "Then we'd better make sure this initiative becomes something he can't kill, no matter how much money he throws at it." Naomi looked toward table 14, the candle still burning in the now empty dining room. For the first time since this all began, she felt like they weren't just defending ground, they were advancing. The first chill of November swept through Charleston like a quiet sigh, rattling the palmetto fronds and carrying the briny scent of the harbor into the historic district. At the Gray Oak, the days grew shorter, the nights more intimate, candlelight pooling on the white linens, silverware gleaming like small moons. Table 14 remained as it always had these past months, untouched, its single white candle steady against the drafts that slipped in when the front door opened. The card in its frame, reserved in honor of every invisible hand that has served within these walls, had become a quiet landmark. Naomi Carter had stopped counting how many people paused there each night. Some left flowers, others a folded note. A few simply rested their fingertips on the table's polished surface, as if it might grant them a little of its unspoken strength. But peace in Charleston had always been fragile. 2 weeks after the gala, Grant Whitmore made his move. Through a series of legal maneuvers, he tried to challenge the Carter Initiative's non-profit status, claiming it was a front for personal gain. His team filed paperwork, fed rumors to the press, and leaned on city officials. Naomi was ready. She had kept meticulous records, donor agreements, expenditure reports, public benefit contracts, all airtight. When the city called for a hearing, she didn't send a lawyer. She walked in herself, flanked by Edward Langford and Daniel Whitmore. "This isn't about me," she told the panel. "It's about whether Charleston belongs to the people who built it or to the people who think they can buy it." Her voice was steady, but inside she felt the familiar hum of standing in the line of fire. Grant attended, of course. He sat in the back, expression unreadable, hands folded over his knee. When the panel voted unanimously to dismiss his claims, a murmur of approval rippled through the chamber. Naomi didn't turn to look at him, but she felt the weight of his gaze as she walked out. On the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed, cameras flashed. Naomi lifted her chin. "The candle at table 14 will keep burning," she said, "and so will we." That Sunday evening, the Gray Oak was quieter than usual. Edward was at the bar, reading over the week's bookings. Daniel had stopped in for coffee after a board meeting. Naomi was polishing glasses when a girl of maybe 9 or 10 approached table 14. She had auburn hair pulled into a loose braid and wore a faded cardigan over a cotton dress. She stood there for a moment, looking at the candle, before turning to Naomi. "Why's this table always empty?" the girl asked. Naomi crouched so they were eye level. "It's to honor the people who worked here before anyone noticed their names, the ones who made the place feel like home." The girl thought for a moment. "My mom says sometimes people work really hard and no one ever says thank you." Naomi smiled gently. "That's why we keep it empty, so people remember to say it." The girl's eyes flicked to the card on the table. "Do you think maybe one day I could work here? Be a chef?" Naomi reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded linen napkin. In one corner, stitched in neat green thread, was her own name. She placed it in the girl's hands. "One day," Naomi said, "you'll be the chef who sees people and makes them seen." The girl's smile was small but certain, the kind that carried a promise. She clutched the napkin like it was something far more valuable than fabric. Later that night, after the last table had been cleared, Naomi lingered at table 14. She lit a fresh candle and watched the flame settle into its steady burn. Edward joined her, his hands in his pockets. "You know," he said quietly, "Grant could walk away from this whole mess tomorrow, and the table would still matter." "That's the point," Naomi replied. "It's bigger than him now, bigger than all of us." Daniel approached, holding 2 envelopes. "From the initiative," he said, handing one to Edward and one to Naomi. Inside were photographs from the first funded projects: a restored bakery on East Bay Street, a group of apprentices in chef's whites, a repainted row of historic storefronts. Naomi's chest tightened, not with the tension of battle, but with something lighter, steadier. They locked up together that night, the 3 of them stepping out into the cool Charleston air. Naomi paused to glance back through the front window. Inside, the candle at table 14 burned alone in the darkened dining room, its reflection doubled in the glass. Steady, unmoving, a beacon not for victory, but for remembrance. She knew the battles would come and go. Grant Whitmore would find other deals, other cities. But this table, this promise, would stay. And so would she. Thank you for staying with Naomi Carter, Edward Langford, and Daniel Whitmore until the very last page of this story. From an overlooked table 14 to a candle burning for the invisible hands who built it all, we've shared a journey not just about protecting a restaurant, but about keeping the heart of an entire city alive. If you believe there will always be candles worth keeping lit, don't forget to subscribe and join us for more stories like this. See you on the next journey.